Well, that's one of my favorite parables. There is just something fun about Jesus telling something to a whole group of people that they know is about them, and he knows they're not going to like it, and he tells it to them anyways. But then again, this parable also makes me really, really nervous because, well, you'll find out in a minute. See, Jesus is talking to the chief priests and the elders. He's continuing the conversation that he had with them in the past couple weeks' gospel. He had just told them that John the Baptist had came to show them the way of righteousness, and they did not believe him, but instead the tax collectors and prostitutes do. And then even after they saw that, they still didn't believe. And then he starts talking about a vineyard. Now, you might have figured out by the psalm and the lesson from Isaiah today that this idea of a vineyard shows up a couple times in the Bible. And usually it refers to Israel. It's the way that God talks about his people as a vineyard that he built up, he planted, he put a wall around, he set a watchtower up, he set a wine press up, did all this stuff that you do to keep a vineyard safe. All the things that we've been thinking about doing over yonder to keep it, to keep the community garden from getting eaten by deer when we get to that point. Because it's going to be a fun problem. But Jesus continues on saying that this landowner, the guy who built the vineyard, he went off on vacation and hired some people to watch over his vineyard. And then when the harvest came, he went to send a servant to say, hey, time for you to give my master his share of the profit, seeing as you worked his land. And instead of doing the sensible thing and just giving the landowner his share, they killed the servant. So he sent another and they killed him. So they sent another and they killed him. So he sent, and so on and so on and so on. Until finally the owner said, okay, maybe if I send my son, they'll actually listen to him and respect him, and I'll get my share. Now, I ain't gonna lie. This is the most compassionate landowner ever, right? At what point does he call the army to come in and say, hey, these guys are stealing from me and killing my people? You ever noticed that? He never actually does that. He never goes to the Roman equivalent of the police force. And it always should strike you as odd. But anyways, the son gets there, and the people think, oh, I know what we'll do. If we kill the son, then we get the inheritance. Wait, what? That doesn't make much sense, but they were rather convinced of it. So they killed the son, and then Jesus asks his listeners, so, when the landowner finally gets home, what's he going to do to them? And they say, well, he'll bring those wretches to a wretched end and then rent the vineyard out to other better tenants. And Jesus says, yep, that's exactly what he's going to do. And at that point, they all went, oh, right, this was about us. We ought to kill this guy now, but we don't want to because we're afraid of the crowds because they really like him, so we're going to wait for later. And it's pretty much exactly what they did. This is the second-ish day of Holy Week when this happens, so that's why they got Judas to tell him when Jesus was going to be by himself so that they could arrest him without dealing with the crowds. Now, that's well and good, and I'm sure you've heard this parable a million times about how, the Pharisees missed the boat, and we're now part of God's family because the Pharisees missed the boat, and so here we all are. We're the ones, we're the new tenants, and that's well and great. But I think sometimes we forget that in giving the Pharisees a bad name, we forget who they are, because they're the folk that went to church every week. Did you ever think about that? I mean, we talk about the Pharisees and how they're always, not fair, you see, for the two of you that know that song. I sing it all the time, and I'm surprised not less of you know. Anyway, we give the Pharisees this bad name, but they went to church every week. They did all the right things. They gave money. They did service. They kind of look like us. Do you get why this parable is starting to make me nervous now? Because the Pharisees were the ones that were going to church. They were the ones that thought that they were on God's good side. So it has to make me wonder, what would we do if Jesus showed up today? How would we react to Jesus' presence as a church? In the famous Grand Inquisitor sketch by Dostoevsky, well, it didn't go so good for Jesus. The leaders of the church basically said, we got a good thing going here, Jesus. We don't really need you anymore. Would we do that? Or would we actually pay attention to him? I wonder if Jesus would fit into human plans for the church. And it's hard because we start to think like Pharisees. We have our own lists, just like the list that Paul had in Philippians. We've got ours. I was baptized January 1st, 1983. I was confirmed. I had first communion. I even went to seminary. I'm a pastor. I try not to sin, but when I do, I confess. I'm sure we all have lists just like that. We can say, oh yeah, I got all that. The problem is, just like Paul's list, our lists are worthless. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance because our translations sanitize the word that Paul uses quite a bit. It would be much more accurate to translate it as dog crap. That's the strength of the word that Paul uses there when our Bible translated it as rubbish or garbage. It is something that is good for absolutely nothing. Because the thing that is everything is not what we do, but it is Jesus. That's who is everything. Not some abstract concept of Jesus, not an idea about who Jesus is, the person, Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, we've turned Jesus into more of an idea than a person. And when Jesus becomes an idea, he can be manipulated. When Jesus becomes an idea, he can fit into whatever we want him to be. When Jesus went to the church of his time and told them that they were doing that, they had a choice. They could either react and say, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that. And a few of them did. There were two that we know of that said, oh yeah, this really isn't going the right way, and we get where you're at, Jesus. It was a guy named Joseph and a guy named Nicodemus. Those were the two that we know about of the Jewish ruling elder folk that got who Jesus was as a person. But the rest of them, instead of trying to get on God's page again, they said, oh, we don't like this. This guy's telling us we're wrong. I know what we'll do. We'll get angry. But even when they got angry, Jesus didn't. I'm always so struck by when the same people that he was probably talking about today were making fun of him on the cross. He said, forgive them. Even when the people that were trying to kill him, he loved them. That's what Jesus the person does. Interestingly enough, that's what Dostoevsky has Jesus do in the Grand Inquisitor sketch. After the Inquisitor sentences Jesus to death, Jesus silently goes up and kisses him. That's it. It's the only thing Jesus does in the whole sketch. He loved him. It's because of Jesus, that person who loves, that Paul considers all of his accomplishments worthless. It's because of Jesus, that person, that we're even here today. So we have to be careful when we talk about Jesus that we're not talking about this idea. We're not just talking about this abstract concept of a guy who goes out and healed some folk and then died and was raised to new life. Because the idea is going to get us nowhere. Knowing about Jesus is about as good as, it does me about as good as knowing about a pew. But knowing Jesus, the person, that's when we can stay on the right path. That's when we avoid becoming like the Pharisees, when the idea of God became more important than God. That's when we know Jesus, that life isn't about going to church. It's not about following a list of do's and don'ts. It becomes about love. And in following him, loving God and loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. That's why this parable is such a warning to me, because it reminds me that we need to focus on the person. We need to remember that Jesus is real and not just some idea. Because when we know Jesus and become his disciples, that's when we have life. That's when we have forgiveness of sins. And that's when we are set free.